The massive space station hung in the darkness like a giant metal city. Inside its biggest meeting room, hundreds of alien creatures sat around a glowing table that stretched as far as the eye could see. The air buzzed with worried voices speaking in dozens of different languages, all translated by tiny devices floating near each speaker's head. Ambassador Kaltara stood at the center of it all, her blue scales shimmering under the bright lights. She was tall and thin, with 4 arms that moved gracefully as she spoke. But today, those same arms shook with fear as she touched the control panel in front of her. The lights dimmed, and suddenly the room filled with 3-dimensional pictures floating in the air above everyone's heads. What they saw made even the bravest warriors in the room gasp in horror. Entire planets covered in black, crystal-like growths. Cities that once held billions of people now looked like dark, twisted sculptures. Space stations torn apart and consumed, leaving nothing but empty shells drifting through the void. Solar systems that had been home to advanced civilizations for thousands of years were now lifeless graveyards. "This is the Centauri system," Kaltara said, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 weeks ago, it was home to 12 billion Centauri people. Now look at it. The image zoomed in to show a planet that looked like it had been covered in black ice. But this wasn't ice, it was something alive, something that pulsed and moved like a giant heart. Spiky towers of dark crystal jutted up from the surface, reaching toward space like grasping fingers. The void swarm arrived on a Tuesday, Kaltara continued. By Friday, everything was gone. Every person, every animal, every plant. The swarm consumed it all and used the energy to grow stronger. An old alien with gray skin and 6 eyes spoke up from the back of the room. "Surely our combined fleets can stop them. We have the most powerful weapons in the galaxy." Kaltara's expression grew even more grim. "We tried, Commander Vex. The battle fleets of 17 different worlds attacked the swarm at the Rigel system. We brought quantum cannons, plasma destroyers, and gravity bombs. We had ships that could crack moons in half." She waved her hand, and new images appeared. Massive warships, some the size of entire cities, floating dead in space. Their hulls were covered in the same black crystal growths. The swarm studied our attack patterns. Within 6 hours, they had adapted completely. Our most powerful weapons became useless. Worse, they absorbed our ships and used them to make themselves stronger. Every battle we fight, every weapon we use, just makes them more dangerous. A creature that looked like a walking tree with golden leaves rustled nervously. "What about the Titan defense grid? The weapon that can destroy entire star systems?" "Gone," Kaltara replied flatly. "The swarm learned how to turn it against us. They used our own ultimate weapon to consume 3 more civilizations." The room erupted in panicked chatter. Aliens argued in their native languages while translation devices worked overtime. Some demanded retreat to the outer galaxy. Others suggested hiding in deep space until the swarm moved on. A few spoke of surrender, hoping the creatures might show mercy. Council leader Mordix, a massive creature with purple fur and tusks like an elephant, slammed his fist on the table. "Silence," he roared. "There must be something we can do. Some weapon we haven't tried, some strategy we haven't considered." Kaltara looked around the room at all the frightened faces staring back at her. These were representatives of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. Races that had mastered faster-than-light travel, created artificial intelligence, and built cities that floated in the clouds of gas giants. They were masters of logic, efficiency, and perfect military strategy. And they were completely helpless. "There is one possibility," she said slowly. "But you're not going to like it." The room grew quiet again. Everyone leaned forward, desperate for any hope. "The humans," Kaltara said. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, shouts of disbelief, and nervous laughter filled the chamber. Several aliens actually stood up and started walking toward the exits. "The Deathworlders," sputtered Mordix. "You want to ask those, those maniacs for help. Everyone in the galaxy knew about Earth. It was the planet that shouldn't exist, a world so dangerous that it seemed designed to kill anything that lived there. The weather could freeze you solid or cook you alive. The ground shook without warning, swallowing entire cities. The very air could become poisonous during certain seasons. But somehow, humans had not just survived on this nightmare world, they had thrived. They turned the planet's deadliest creatures into pets. They built cities in places where the land itself tried to kill them. They went swimming in waters filled with monsters and called it fun. Most disturbing of all, humans seemed to enjoy chaos. Where other species sought order and predictability, humans actively looked for dangerous, unpredictable situations. They had a saying, "Hold my beer and watch this." Every alien diplomat who had visited Earth came back with stories that sounded too crazy to believe. "Think about it," Kaltara said, raising her voice above the protests. "Every military strategy we've tried has been logical, predictable, efficient. The swarm adapts because they can understand our thinking. They know what we're going to do before we do it." She pointed at the images still floating in the air. "But humans don't think like us. They don't follow logical patterns. They make decisions that seem completely insane, and somehow they work. The swarm can't adapt to chaos if they can't predict what comes next." Mordix shook his massive head. "Those savages would probably try to punch the swarm to death with their bare hands." "Exactly," Kaltara said. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need. While we're calculating optimal firing solutions and perfect battle formations, humans would charge straight into the enemy and start improvising. They do things so crazy that even we can't predict them." A small, bird-like creature with bright feathers spoke up. "But humans are primitives. They've barely left their own solar system. What could they possibly do that our advanced civilizations cannot?" The massive space station hung in the darkness like a giant metal city. On a planet that's biggest 4 billion years trying to alien creatures sat around a glowing table that stretched as far as the apex predators. The air buzzed with worried voices and started looking for bigger challenges, all translated by tiny devices as everyone considered each speaker's head. It was true that humans had an unusual relationship with danger. Her blue scales shimmering under the bright lights. While other species avoided risk, humans seemed tall and thin, with 4 arms they had turned nearly everything into a competition, including today, who could survive the most dangerous situation as she touched the control panel. The swarm operates on perfect efficiency. The lights dimmed, and suddenly the room filled with 3-dimensional pictures floating in the air above everyone's dangerous, inefficient, what they saw made even the bravest warriors in the room gasp in horror. They don't adapt to their environment. Entire planets covered in black, crystal-like growths. Mordix was quiet cities for a long moment. Held billions of people now looked like the images of destroyed sculptures. Finally, space stations torn apart and consumed, leaving nothing but empty shells drifting through the humans for help, will never solar live it systems down. That had been home to advanced civilizations for thousands of years were now lifeless by a bunch of Deathworld primitives. "This is the Centauri system. Better to be alive and embarrassed than extinct, her voice barely above a whisper," Kaltara replied. 3 weeks ago, the vote was home to 12 billion Centauri people. As alien representatives reluctantly agreed to contact her, zoomed in to show a planet that looked like it had been covered in black ice. They were thinking in terms of military advisors and strategic consultants, that pulsed and moved like a giant They had no idea they were about to meet humans towers of dark crystal jutted out from the surface, be an interesting reaching toward space like grasping fingers, to be a personal invitation. The void swarm arrived on a Tuesday, Kaltara continued. By Friday, everything was gone. Every person, every animal, every plant. The swarm consumed it all and used the energy to grow stronger. An old alien with gray skin and 6 eyes spoke up from the back of the room. "Surely our combined fleets can stop them. We have the most powerful weapons in the galaxy." Kaltara's expression grew even more grim. "We tried, Commander Vex. The battle fleets of 17 different worlds attacked the swarm at the Rigel system. We brought quantum cannons, plasma destroyers, and gravity bombs. We had ships that could crack moons in half." She waved her hand, and new images appeared. Massive warships, some the size of entire cities, floating dead in space. Their hulls were covered in the same black crystal growths. The swarm studied our attack patterns. Within 6 hours, they had adapted completely. Our most powerful weapons became useless. Worse, they absorbed our ships and used them to make themselves stronger. Every battle we fight, every weapon we use, just makes them more dangerous. A creature that looked like a walking tree with golden leaves rustled nervously. What about the Titan defense grid? The weapon that can destroy entire star systems. Gone, Keltara replied flatly. The swarm learned how to turn it against us. They used our own ultimate weapon to consume 3 more civilizations. The room erupted in panicked chatter. Aliens argued in their native languages while translation devices worked overtime. Some demanded retreat to the outer galaxy. Others suggested hiding in deep space until the swarm moved on. A few spoke of surrender, hoping the creatures might show mercy. Council leader Mordex, a massive creature with purple fur and tusks like an elephant, slammed his fist on the table. Silence, he roared. There must be something we can do. Some weapon we haven't tried, some strategy we haven't considered. Keltara looked around the room at all the frightened faces staring back at her. These were representatives of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. Races that had mastered faster-than-light travel, created artificial intelligence, and built cities that floated in the clouds of gas giants. They were masters of logic, efficiency, and perfect military strategy. And they were completely helpless. There is one possibility, she said slowly. But you're not going to like it. The room grew quiet again. Everyone leaned forward, desperate for any hope. The humans, Keltara said. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, shouts of disbelief, and nervous laughter filled the chamber. Several aliens actually stood up and started walking toward the exits. The Deathworlders, sputtered Mordex. You want to ask those maniacs for help. Everyone in the galaxy knew about Earth. It was the planet that shouldn't exist, a world so dangerous that it seemed designed to kill anything that lived there. The weather could freeze you solid or cook you alive. The ground shook without warning, swallowing entire cities. The very air could become poisonous during certain seasons. But somehow, humans had not just survived on this nightmare world, they had thrived. They turned the planet's deadliest creatures into pets. They built cities in places where the land itself tried to kill them. They went swimming in waters filled with monsters and called it fun. Most disturbing of all, humans seemed to enjoy chaos. Where other species sought order and predictability, humans actively looked for dangerous, unpredictable situations. They had a saying, "Hold my beer and watch this." Every alien diplomat who had visited Earth came back with stories that sounded too crazy to believe. Think about it, Keltara said, raising her voice above the protests. Every military strategy we've tried has been logical, predictable, efficient. The swarm adapts because they can understand our thinking. They know what we're going to do before we do it. She pointed at the images still floating in the air. But humans don't think like us. They don't follow logical patterns. They make decisions that seem completely insane, and somehow they work. The swarm can't adapt to chaos if they can't predict what comes next. Mordex shook his massive head. Those savages would probably try to punch the swarm to death with their bare hands. Exactly. Keltara said. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need. While we're calculating optimal firing solutions and perfect battle formations, humans would charge straight into the enemy and start improvising. They do things so crazy that even we can't predict them. A small, bird-like creature with bright feathers spoke up. But humans are primitives. They've barely left their own solar system. What could they possibly do that our advanced civilizations cannot? The Pentagon's underground briefing room looked like something from a science fiction movie. Holographic displays covered every wall, showing star maps and alien technology that would have been impossible to imagine just months ago. The air hummed with the sound of advanced computers processing data from across the galaxy. Colonel Jake Morrison sat at the head of a long metal table, surrounded by thick folders marked, "Top Secret," in bright red letters. He was a tall man with gray hair and tired eyes, the kind of person who had seen too much in his 30 years of military service. But even he had never seen anything like this. Across from him sat 4 people who looked like they belonged in completely different places. They weren't the usual military types you'd expect in a Pentagon meeting. These were the kind of people most generals would cross the street to avoid. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly," said Lisa Parker, leaning back in her chair with her boots up on the table. She was a woman in her early 30s with short blonde hair and scars on her hands that told stories she didn't like to share. "There are space bugs the size of buildings that have eaten 43 entire civilizations, and the smartest aliens in the galaxy want our help because we're too unpredictable for the bugs to figure out." Jake nodded slowly. "That's the basic idea. The aliens have tried everything: weapons that can blow up planets, battle strategies developed by computer minds 1,000 times smarter than ours, fleets of ships with technology we can barely understand. Nothing works. The swarm adapts to every logical approach within hours. But humans aren't logical," added Dr. Emily Rogers, looking up from the tablet she'd been reading. She was a quiet woman with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing a lab coat covered in coffee stains. "We do things that don't make sense, even to ourselves sometimes. And apparently, that's exactly what we need." Tom Bradley, sitting in the corner, let out a loud laugh. He was a big man with calloused hands and a smile that suggested he found the whole situation amusing rather than terrifying. "Space bugs that eat planets, huh? Sounds like a regular Tuesday to me, boss. At least these ones probably don't hide underground waiting to blow your legs off." Tom had spent the last 5 years in the most dangerous job on Earth, clearing minefields and war zones around the world. He'd walked through fields where one wrong step meant instant death, and he'd done it with a smile on his face. The idea of fighting space monsters didn't seem to worry him at all. "The psychological profile on these creatures is fascinating," Emily continued, scrolling through data on her tablet. "They operate on pure efficiency. Every action calculated for maximum result with minimum energy expenditure. They've conquered dozens of civilizations by studying their tactics and adapting faster than their enemies can change strategy." Mike Anderson, who had been quietly studying the star maps on the wall, turned around and cracked his knuckles. "When do we ship out?" he asked simply. Mike was the kind of person who made other Marines nervous. Not because he was violent or unpredictable, but because he was too calm about situations that should terrify any sane person. He'd once spent 6 months stranded on an alien world that was trying to kill him every single day, and he'd not only survived, he'd actually gained weight. Jake spread out more documents on the table. "The aliens are sending a ship to pick us up in 72 hours. But before we agree to anything, I need to make sure everyone understands what we're volunteering for." He pointed to a series of photographs showing the aftermath of swarm attacks. "These creatures don't just kill civilizations, they absorb them. Every person, every animal, every plant gets broken down and used to make the swarm stronger. The aliens estimate that if we can't stop them, they'll consume the entire galaxy within 2 years." Lisa picked up one of the photos. It showed what had once been a beautiful alien city, now covered in black crystal growths that pulsed with their own light. "And the aliens think we can stop this because we're crazy enough to try things that shouldn't work." "It's more than that," Emily explained. "Look at human military history. We've won battles we should have lost by doing things that made no logical sense. We charge uphill into machine gun fire. We use explosions to solve problems that require delicate precision. We turn our own weaknesses into weapons." Tom nodded enthusiastically. "Remember that time in Iraq when Johnson used a microwave oven to disable an enemy communications array? No manual in the world would suggest that, but it worked perfectly." "Or the Battle of Midway," added Mike. "We had 4 aircraft carriers and a crazy plan that any computer would say was impossible. The Japanese had the most powerful navy in the world and perfect intelligence. They should have wiped us out. Instead, we sunk 4 of their carriers in one day. Jake stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Pentagon parking lot where ordinary people were living ordinary lives, completely unaware that the fate of the galaxy was being decided in a basement conference room. The aliens have given us access to their technology, he said. Ships that can cross the galaxy in days, weapons that can level mountains, armor that can stop almost anything. But they want us to use these tools the way humans would use them, not the way their instruction manuals say we should. So basically, Lisa said with a grin, they want us to take their fancy space toys and break all the rules. Pretty much, Jake confirmed. They've tried fighting this enemy with logic, strategy, and overwhelming force. Now they want to try fighting it with controlled chaos and calculated stupidity. Emily looked up from her tablet again. The interesting thing is that the swarm seems to have one major weakness. They can't adapt to truly random behavior because randomness has no pattern to learn from. But humans aren't random, we're chaotic. There's a difference. What's the difference? Mike asked. Random means anything can happen for no reason, Emily explained. Chaotic means that crazy things happen, but there's still a human mind behind them making decisions. We do insane things, but we do them for human reasons. And that's something no alien mind has ever had to deal with. Tom slapped the table with his hand. So we're going to save the galaxy by being ourselves. That's the plan, Jake said. The question is, are you all insane enough to volunteer for a mission where the best-case scenario is that we save every living thing in the universe, and the worst-case scenario is that we get eaten by space bugs? The 4 team members looked at each other for a moment. Then Lisa started laughing. Emily smiled and shook her head. Tom's grin got even wider. And Mike just shrugged like someone had asked him if he wanted coffee with his breakfast. Boss, Lisa said, you had me at space bugs that eat planets. When do we leave? The stars disappeared in a flash of blue light as 4 human ships dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of what the aliens called the death zone. What greeted them was a sight that would have made any rational military commander order an immediate retreat. Stretching out before them was a wall of darkness that seemed to eat light itself. Massive black crystal structures, some the size of entire moons, drifted through space like hungry predators. They pulsed with an evil red glow that made them look alive, and angry. Between the larger formations, millions of smaller creatures swarmed like angry hornets, each one the size of a fighter jet but moving with the coordination of a single giant organism. Well, that's not terrifying at all, Lisa's voice came through the communication system, though she sounded more excited than scared. Her ship, painted with a grinning shark face on the nose, hung in space next to the others. Inside the cockpit, she was grinning just as widely as the painted shark. Jake's command ship, loaded with alien technology that had been hastily bolted onto human engineering, floated in the center of their small formation. Through his window, he could see the swarm formations moving with perfect mathematical precision. Every creature knew exactly where it was supposed to be, every movement calculated for maximum efficiency. Remember what the aliens told us, Jake's voice crackled over the radio. These things have defeated every organized military force they've ever faced. They study attack patterns, learn from them, and adapt. Within hours, they can counter any strategy perfectly. So we don't use a strategy, Tom replied from his ship, which looked more like a flying bomb than a spacecraft. He'd personally overseen the installation of explosive charges in places that made the alien engineers cry. We just do what humans do best, improvise and cause chaos. Emily's voice came through the comm system, calm and scientific even in the face of cosmic horror. The biological scans are incredible. These creatures operate as a single mind distributed across millions of bodies. It's the most efficient biological system I've ever seen. Efficient is boring, Mike added. His ship was the smallest of the group, but it was built like a battering ram. Where other ships had elegant curves, his was all sharp angles and reinforced plating. Let's show them what inefficient looks like. Jake took a deep breath. Everything he'd learned in 30 years of military service told him that what they were about to do was suicide. No battle plan, no coordinated strategy, no backup. Just 4 humans in modified ships about to attack an enemy that had consumed 43 entire civilizations. "All right, people," he said. "Remember, no coordinated attacks. We fight like humans. Messy, unpredictable, and completely insane by their standards. Show these bugs what chaos looks like." Lisa's ship suddenly roared forward, diving straight into the heart of the swarm formation like a meteor falling into an ocean. Her weapons fired in patterns that seemed completely random, sometimes at the biggest targets, sometimes at empty space, sometimes in spirals that spelled out curse words in laser fire. "Come on, you crystal freaks," she yelled over the radio. "Let's dance." The swarm's perfect formation immediately began to shift, trying to adapt to her attack pattern. But there was no pattern to adapt to. Lisa was firing at whatever caught her attention, dodging based on pure instinct, and generally flying like someone who had learned to pilot by crashing into things until she stopped crashing. Tom's ship erupted in a series of controlled explosions that lit up space like a 4th of July fireworks show. But these weren't random explosions, they were carefully placed to create maximum confusion. Each blast was timed to disrupt the swarm's formation just as they were trying to reorganize. "Art in motion, people." Tom laughed as another explosion sent a cluster of swarm creatures spinning away from their assigned positions. "This is what we call creative destruction." The alien engineers who had worked on their ships would have been horrified. Tom was using precision explosive devices designed for mining operations as weapons of mass confusion. Instead of trying to destroy the enemy efficiently, he was using his explosions to create chaos, forcing the swarm to waste energy reorganizing constantly. Emily's ship moved through the battle zone like a careful scientist conducting an experiment. She wasn't firing weapons at all. Instead, she was releasing clouds of biological agents that she designed specifically to confuse the swarm's communication systems. "Data suggests they're having trouble adapting to intentional inefficiency," she reported calmly, even as swarm creatures the size of buildings tried to grab her ship with crystal claws. "Their hive mind is designed to process logical information quickly. They literally don't know how to handle deliberate stupidity." Mike's approach was the most human of all. While the others were using fancy tactics and clever strategies, he was just ramming his ship into anything that moved. His reinforced vessel slammed into swarm creatures like a wrecking ball, sending them spinning into their neighbors and disrupting their perfect formations. "This is what we call a Tuesday back home," he yelled as his ship crushed through a formation of smaller creatures. "You bugs picked the wrong species to mess with." The results were immediate and shocking. The swarm, which had operated with perfect coordination for thousands of years, began to fall apart. Creatures collided with each other as they tried to adapt to Lisa's random attacks. Tom's explosions kept disrupting their attempts to form new strategies. Emily's confusion agents made it impossible for them to coordinate responses. And Mike's ramming attacks were so illogical that the hive mind couldn't even process them as a real military tactic. For the first time in their existence, the swarm was confused. They had faced laser weapons, plasma cannons, quantum torpedoes, and gravity bombs. They had adapted to every form of logical warfare. But they had never faced an enemy that deliberately chose the worst possible tactical options and somehow made them work. Jake watched from his command ship as the supposedly invincible enemy began to retreat. The perfect formations were breaking down into chaos as individual creatures tried to follow contradictory orders from a hive mind that couldn't understand what it was fighting. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "It's actually working." But even as the immediate swarm forces pulled back, Jake could see something massive moving in the distance. Something so big it blotted out entire stars as it moved. The swarm queen was coming, and she was not happy about these strange new enemies who refused to follow the rules of warfare. The real battle was just beginning, and the humans were about to learn why 43 civilizations had failed to stop these creatures. But for the first time in galactic history, the swarm had encountered an enemy they couldn't understand, and that made all the difference. The space around them had turned into a battlefield that looked like hell itself. Broken pieces of alien technology floated everywhere, spinning slowly in the darkness. The 4 human ships, once sleek and powerful, now looked like they'd been through a blender. Scorch marks covered their hulls, and sparks flew from damaged systems. But none of that mattered anymore, because something impossible was happening right in front of them. Reality was tearing apart like wet paper. A massive crack in space itself stretched across the star field, and through it came something that made every other horror they'd faced look like a house cat. The Swarm Queen emerged from the dimensional rift like a nightmare-given form. She was bigger than anything had a right to be. Her crystalline body stretched for miles in every direction, covered in spikes and growths that pulsed with angry red light. She didn't just look alive, she looked furious. And she was focused entirely on the 4 tiny human ships that had dared to disrupt her perfect order. Jake's command ship shook as the Queen's presence alone sent waves of energy through space. His instruments were going crazy, showing readings that shouldn't be possible. "Holy Mother of God," he whispered, staring at the monster that had just made their previous battles look like warm-up exercises. "She's learning," Emily's voice came through the radio, though her ship was barely holding together. Smoke filled her cockpit, and half her screens were dead. "Jake, she's adapting to our chaos. Look at the patterns." Jake looked at his tactical display and felt his heart sink. The Queen wasn't just bigger than the other swarm creatures, she was smarter. She was studying their random attack patterns and finding the underlying human logic that made them work. Even chaos, it seemed, had rules when humans were behind it. Lisa's ship limped through space, one engine completely dead and the other stuttering like a dying car. "Well, that's just great," she said. "We finally found something too smart for human stupidity." The Queen's massive form shifted, and suddenly the space around them filled with thousands of smaller swarm creatures, all moving in perfect coordination. But this time, they weren't trying to form logical battle formations. They were copying the humans' chaotic tactics, turning their own weapons against them. Tom's ship, which had been held together mostly by prayer and explosive charges, was taking the worst beating. His voice came over the radio, and for the first time since they'd met him, he sounded serious. "Guys, I've been doing some math," he said. "And the math says we're screwed. She's not just adapting to our chaos, she's perfecting it. Making it more efficient." Mike's ship was the closest to the Queen, and he was doing what he did best, ramming into anything that moved. But even his reinforced hull couldn't take much more punishment. "Any bright ideas, people? Because I'm running out of things to hit." Emily's fingers flew over her damaged instruments, trying to analyze the creature that was systematically destroying everything they'd worked for. "The dimensional rift," she said suddenly. "That's how she got here, but it's also her weakness. She's maintaining it through some kind of quantum beacon. If we could destabilize it, she'd be cut off from whatever dimension she came from," Jake finished. "But the beacon is protected by about 1,000,000 swarm creatures, and we've got maybe 10 minutes before our ships fall apart completely." Tom's voice cut through their discussion, and this time it was completely calm. "I've got enough explosives left to collapse this entire asteroid field. That should clear a path to the beacon and buy you guys some time." The radio went quiet for a moment as everyone realized what he was suggesting. "Tom, that's suicide," Lisa said, her voice tight with emotion. "You'll be at ground zero of the biggest explosion in human history." "Nah," Tom replied, and they could hear him smiling. "That's not suicide. That's just human. We've been blowing things up to solve problems since we invented gunpowder. This is just thinking bigger." Jake started to object, started to say they'd find another way, but Tom kept talking. "Besides, someone's got to tell my wife I went out with style. She always said I'd die doing something stupid with explosives. Might as well prove her right." Before anyone could stop him, Tom's ship roared toward the largest concentration of swarm creatures, straight into the heart of enemy territory. The last thing they heard over the radio was Tom laughing like a maniac and shouting, "Fire in the hole." The explosion that followed lit up half the galaxy. It wasn't just big, it was beautiful in a way that only humans could appreciate. Tom had turned his ship into the universe's largest firework, and for a few seconds, it burned brighter than the nearest star. When the light faded, a path had been cleared through the swarm forces. Hundreds of enemy creatures had been destroyed or scattered, and the way to the quantum beacon was open. But they'd paid for it with the life of one of the best demolitions experts Earth had ever produced. Mike's ship was heavily damaged, but he was still fighting. Through his cockpit window, Jake could see him in the wreckage of an alien space station, literally punching swarm drones with his bare hands after his ship's weapons had failed. It was the most ridiculous thing Jake had ever seen, and somehow it was working. "The override controls for the beacon are on the other side of the rift," Emily reported, her voice strained as she fought to keep her ship operational. "Someone has to fly through that dimensional tear and shut it down manually. But Jake, whoever goes through isn't coming back. The rift will collapse the moment the beacon shuts down." Jake didn't hesitate. He'd been a soldier his entire life, and this was what soldiers did. They made the hard choices so other people didn't have to. He started moving toward the manual controls of his ship. "I'll do it," he said simply. "It's been an honor serving with all of you." But before he could reach the controls, something hard hit him in the back of the head, and the world went dark. When he woke up a few seconds later, his head pounding, Lisa's voice was coming through the radio from outside his ship. "Sorry, Colonel," she said, and he could hear the grin in her voice even though she was flying towards certain death. "Captain's prerogative. Besides, you've got people back home who need you to come back and tell this story." Jake watched helplessly as Lisa's damaged ship turned toward the dimensional rift, heading straight into the unknown. She was flying towards something that would kill her, and she was doing it to save everyone else. It was the most human thing he'd ever witnessed.